Hey, welcome to That One Time, the place for unforgettable moments and stories worth sharing. Funny, touching, surprising, just like life itself. Grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's dive in. In the village quiet where Sarah was born and spent her childhood years, she was a late child, one prayed for from fate. Because of that, the girl seemed to bathe in the cradle of parental love and boundless acceptance. Every moment of hers was warmed by care, gentle smiles, and tender embraces. Almost everyone living nearby showed her attention. That's just how it was. Only those whose means allowed them left their native places, heading for the city. Sarah studied at a modest village school. In her class, besides herself, only 4 other children sat at desks. The girl knew that in city schools, classes numbered 30 or even more pupils, but imagining such a crowd was almost impossible for her. Time went by relentlessly. Sarah grew rapidly, acquiring the features of youth. In her adolescence came the realization she wanted something more than the usual way of life. Her parents were people of amazing kindness and honesty, but lacking in special ambitions and zeal. They were content with what they had, preferring peace and tranquility to the hustle of striving. There was enough for daily bread and simple clothes, and that was fine. But one day, this unshakable peace was shattered by tragedy. What happened became the turning point that forever changed Sarah's worldview. A severe illness struck her father. He was taken to the city for examination and placed in a hospital. An expensive operation was required. Of course, the family didn't have such funds. Even selling their dilapidated parental home, they couldn't raise the necessary sum. The elderly man was treated, of course, but the free therapy proved powerless against the onslaught of the disease. In the end, the illness took its toll. Sarah and her mother were left alone in the world. It was then that a firm decision solidified in the girl's soul. Come what may, it was necessary to achieve at least significant prosperity. Money, she realized, wasn't just banknotes, it was freedom, a reliable shield, a key to solving many problems. Sarah decided to start her path to this goal by getting a decent education. Before, she had thought of limiting herself to a college in the nearest town. Now, her gaze was fixed on the capital. It seemed distant, difficult, frightening, but it was there. She knew that the most tempting opportunities were concentrated. Her mother, though anxious for her daughter, wholeheartedly supported her impulse and even hired tutors for Sarah, despite the family's meager means. Sarah studied with furious tenacity, gnawing at the granite of science, forgetting about friends, idle strolls, and rest as such. She realized she needed to make up for huge gaps in her knowledge. The girl studied on her own and with tutors. All these efforts were not in vain. Soon, Sarah managed to get into a university in the capital in the economics department and even on a budget place. Seeing her name on the enrollment lists, the happy graduate couldn't contain her impulse. She jumped for joy. It hadn't been in vain, she had succeeded. The university, of course, wasn't among the most prestigious, but it readily provided dormitory accommodation for out-of-town students, and for Sarah, this was vitally important. She simply couldn't afford to rent accommodation in the capital, and here was such a saving straw. So the girl left her native Alexandrovka. She promised her mother she would definitely graduate from the institute, find a good job, establish herself in Moscow, and then bring her mother to live with her. The medicine is better there. Life is more interesting, she convinced the elderly woman. You'll see, we'll be happy there. Her mother smiled, nodded, but anxiety flickered in her eyes. It was scary for her to let such a young girl go alone, especially to a huge, unfamiliar metropolis. After all, so many dangers lay in wait for an inexperienced provincial girl there. But her mother worried about Sarah in vain. The girl had a goal, and she pursued it with unwavering determination. Student parties, clubs, bar gatherings, all this mostly passed her by. Sometimes Sarah would, of course, go out with friends to unwind, but extremely rarely, for all her thoughts were absorbed by her studies. She saw how easy it was to be expelled from university. Just relax a little, fail a session, and all efforts are wasted. Sarah couldn't afford that. She hadn't worked so hard to get into a capital university for that. Children of wealthy parents, of course, could afford some carelessness. Their knowledge, it seemed, was paid for with rustling banknotes. Sarah didn't have that opportunity, and she was genuinely interested in studying. She felt herself getting smarter, more confident in her abilities. Real prospects were opening up before her. And then came another sorrow. Her mother died. The elderly woman had been feeling unwell for a long time, but she tried not to burden her daughter, understanding how difficult things were for her in the city, and she didn't need her mother's anxieties on top of that. Sarah couldn't believe for a long time that she was completely alone in the world. She had no relatives other than her parents. The girl suffered, cried, reevaluating her life. The exam session, fortunately, she didn't fail. By that time, she had already proven herself well, and they gave her a second chance. They supported her. Gradually, Sarah recovered from the blow and continued her path towards her goal: financial independence. Now that she was alone, this became the most important thing for her. She wanted to feel free, protected. The girls around her, of course, also dreamed of broad opportunities, but they were from well-off families. Maybe not fabulously rich, but still. Beautiful clothes, trendy gadgets, entertainment, travel. All this was a natural part of their lives. For Sarah, money symbolized strength and security. Besides, she understood that there was no one to help her in this life. She would have to rely solely on herself, and so nothing could move her from her chosen path. But there's another way to live beautifully. Alice, a classmate with whom she seemed to have developed a friendship, tried to convince Sarah. Alice constantly urged Sarah to go to a club or bar, giving what she thought were quite weighty arguments. You don't have to become a blue stocking and break your teeth on the granite of science. You're beautiful and young, and there are plenty of rich guys around. Let's go meet someone. You'll see. It's much more fun than poring over textbooks. Sarah just shook her head. No, that option didn't suit her. Dependence on someone. That wasn't what she dreamed of. Dependence. Sarah sighed. She always felt a little uneasy when she remembered her former self, young, full of ambitious plans and bright hopes. Now the woman herself didn't understand how she could have ended up in such a vulnerable position. After all, her attitude was absolutely right. She was going straight for her goal, not being distracted by anything, and everything was working out perfectly for her. How did she end up in such a trap? Sarah shook her head and put away the photo album. These were pictures from her student years. Looking at her former self, she plunged into memories. And sometimes she fantasized about how her fate might have turned out if not for that chance encounter with Mark that turned everything upside down. By then, Sarah had already graduated from university. Immediately after graduation, she was invited to work for a large oil company. She was one of the best students, and her candidacy was recommended to the employer. She had to learn everything anew. Well, maybe not everything, but a lot. What was written in textbooks didn't always find confirmation in practice, and Sarah soon became convinced of this. The girl sometimes stayed at the office until midnight, delving in, mastering, learning from older colleagues' experience. It was difficult, but the salary was pleasing, and the prospects were tempting. Her superiors constantly rewarded her with bonuses. She steadily climbed the career ladder. Soon, Sarah managed to save up for her own apartment. The girl became the owner of a modest one-bedroom apartment, a small flat in a not-so-prestigious area, but it was her personal space, earned through her own labor. True, she had to sell the village house, a piece of her native village, for this. In general, everything was turning out exactly as Sarah had planned. She had a good job, her own apartment. True, she also worked tirelessly for it. But could it have been otherwise? Only in fairy tales and melodramas does wealth fall from the sky. In life, everything has to be achieved through hard work. The girl had learned this truth by heart. It was hard, of course, at times. Sarah sometimes wanted to live like her peers, go out, travel, meet young men, have fun with friends. But she led a completely different life. Work, household chores. Well, she had to rely only on herself, do everything herself. And then one day, Sarah decided to finally take a vacation. She was given 2 weeks off work. She had money for a holiday. Everyone around her was constantly flying and traveling somewhere. In general, why not? Sarah chose a resort that a colleague had recommended to her. She bought herself light, bright outfits, packed her suitcase, and she flew from the cold early spring in Moscow straight into a hot tropical summer, alone. None of her friends could leave the city at that time. Sarah saw the sea for the first time in her life. It was wonderful, lying on the warm sand, exposing her body to the gentle sun, listening to the rustle of the waves. At last, the girl could truly relax and rest. It turned out that a change of scenery works wonders. Sarah didn't even go on excursions. She just rested on the shore, next to the sea, stunning in its power, and felt happy and peaceful. Elderly people were mostly vacationing at the resort at that time. Couples, singles, some with grandchildren. Sarah was quite satisfied with this crowd. She wasn't in the mood for adventures, she wanted peace now. But one day, as she was about to leave the beach to have dinner at the hotel, he approached her, Mark. A young man in shorts and a white t-shirt that hugged his toned torso, emphasizing his bronze tan. Laughing turquoise eyes, a charming white-toothed smile, slightly tousled, sun-bleached hair the color of ripe wheat. "Hi," he greeted Sarah, as if they had known each other for an eternity. "I've been watching you for a long time. You're so beautiful and always alone." "Hi," Sarah smiled back at him. She couldn't take her eyes off his mesmerizing eyes. The guy was truly handsome. They started talking, got acquainted. The young man introduced himself as Mark, said he was vacationing here with his family. They had rented a bungalow near the hotel, and that every evening he watched her, Sarah, from afar because he liked her very much. "You're incredibly beautiful," Mark said, looking Sarah straight in the soul. "Do people tell you that often?" The girl shook her head. She had almost no experience with young men. She never had time. Studying, working, no time for dates and romances. So now the young man's compliments made her head spin. No, men had tried to get acquainted with her before, but Sarah, it was as if she wore armor. In the city, she remembered her goal. She knew she couldn't be scattered. But here, suddenly, Sarah very strongly wanted to be near Mark. He was so handsome, so gallant, so pleasant to talk to. Perhaps it was influenced by the fact that Sarah was at the sea for the first time, and alone. Her mood and perception of the world at that moment were completely different. In short, a romance began between the young people. Beautiful, bright, passionate. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax. Mark showed her completely different places at the resort, not those where tourists crowded. They watched the sunset in the mountains, kissed in flowering groves whose existence nearby Sarah hadn't suspected, scuba dived on deserted beaches, an act Sarah thought she would never dare to do. But Mark persuaded her, she agreed, and never regretted it. She had never seen such beauty with her own eyes, the coral reef and its inhabitants in their natural environment. It was a completely different world. There were clubs too, and discos, and delicious, instantly intoxicating cocktails. Mark seemed genuinely in love with Sarah. He hugged her tenderly, looked at her with admiration, showered her with compliments, gave her gifts. The girl understood that, most likely, this was just a resort romance. And such relationships, as is known, rarely have a continuation. But she tried not to think about it, and for the first time in her life, just enjoyed the moment, getting pleasure without unnecessary reflection. But unexpectedly, the resort romance continued. Sarah flew back to Moscow earlier. Her vacation was ending, she needed to return to work, to her usual life. The day before, Mark held her in his arms for a long time, confessed his love. "I don't want to let you go. I would spend my whole life with you here, in this paradise." Sarah just smiled sadly. She was also sorry that this fairy tale was ending, but she was used to thinking soberly and understood. Mark would quickly forget her, most likely find someone else before the end of his vacation and say the same passionate words to another girl. And he wouldn't be lying. He wasn't lying now, he probably really felt that way. But they had a regular resort romance, there was nothing to count on. Although, of course, the girl also didn't want to part with Mark. Witty, kind, generous. It was so nice to feel again that someone cared about you, that you weren't alone. Sarah didn't expect it, but Mark continued to communicate with her. He called, sent photos from the sea, wrote long messages. The resort romance didn't stay at the resort, and then Mark returned home. He also lived in Moscow, and he invited Sarah on another date. The girl's heart pounded wildly that evening. Could it be? Could it really be true? Mark hadn't forgotten her and wanted to continue. It was interesting to see how their relationship would develop here, in the huge city, not on the seashore. What if Mark was disappointed in her? The girl worried in vain. As soon as he saw Sarah, Mark rushed to her, hugged her, pressed her to him, and all doubts immediately disappeared. Can you imagine how much I missed you? You were in my dreams. A chance meeting at the resort grew into something more. The young people became very close. Sarah knew that Mark was still living with his parents. He had graduated from the economics department, worked at his uncle's firm, but dreamed of his own business. The plan was ready. All that was missing was money to start. But Mark was working hard on it, saving up, investing. In general, trying to start something of his own. They talked a lot about this future venture. Sarah found the idea quite promising. She had enough knowledge and experience to discuss this topic with Mark. Her husband amazed her with his intelligence and creativity. "I'm not afraid of anything at all," the guy would sometimes say. "Together we'll move mountains, build a whole empire, become rich and independent. And we'll be able to travel calmly, without thinking about anything, to rest. Hired workers will do everything for us," Sarah immediately picked up. "True, we won't achieve this quickly. It's okay. We can do everything together. We'll overcome everything." Soon, Mark and Sarah started living together. They decided to settle in Sarah's apartment. Mark had his own separate living space. His parents had bought him an apartment in a prestigious area, but they also set a condition. Their son would move there only after getting married. It was supposed to be a family nest, not a bachelor pad. Gradually, the young people began to build their own business. Things didn't move quickly. Sarah and Mark continued to work at their previous jobs, but every spare penny was now invested in the business. They had to save on some things, cut back, but both understood what all these sacrifices were for. It soon became clear that they needed large investments for further development. "Where do we get the money?" Mark asked one day. "What if you sell your apartment? This one-bedroom flat? We won't live here anyway. We need something bigger, more decent. But the money will be just enough to get our company off the ground." Sarah shook her head. How could she sell her one-bedroom flat? Yes, the apartment was small, but it was her own home, earned by her own labor, especially since their business was still very unstable, and it was unknown if anything serious would come of it at all. "Well, where will we live?" Sarah asked. She simply didn't know what to say to her beloved. "I've thought of everything. We'll get married. I've wanted to propose to you for a long time anyway. We'll get married and move into my apartment. You know my parents set that condition. Only with a wife in the new apartment. The apartment is big, beautiful, in a good area. We'll be better off there. And we'll sell your one-bedroom flat and put the money into circulation. We'll succeed, you'll see. We'll be rich, just like we dreamed of once, and we'll achieve everything ourselves, understand?" Spots danced before Sarah's eyes. So much at once, the proposal to sell the apartment and talk of marriage. It required reflection. But Mark was so convincing and inspired. Indeed, why doubt? Mark had proven the sincerity of his feelings more than once. They were together, closer to each other than anyone else. A happy family life and a joint business lay ahead. Mark was reliable as a rock. He loved her. She saw it in his eyes. So what was there to think about? Mark and Sarah got married a month after that conversation. They didn't have a lavish wedding, although the groom's parents insisted on a grand celebration. Of course, their only son was getting married. But Sarah, who could she invite? She had no relatives and not too many friends either. And the money. The funds that would have to be spent on the celebration were better saved for business development. Both were passionate about this idea. The business was their common brainchild and shared dream. So Mark and Sarah, after signing the registry, simply sat with the groom's parents in a restaurant, celebrated the event, talked, and got to know each other better. Mark's father quickly excused himself. He was a busy man, someone was constantly calling him, his participation in work processes was required. But Mark's mother, Eleanor, was already retired. She used to work with her husband, but now she had stepped away from business, and she was in no hurry. Sarah never understood whether Eleanor liked her or not. She behaved like the Snow Queen, unemotional, a little prim, impeccably polite. It was impossible to guess from her face what feelings this woman was experiencing at any given moment. Sarah immediately understood. Their relationship would not become close. She wasn't that kind of person. And it was a pity. She so wanted to feel warmth and acceptance. "Mom, she's just like that," Mark explained later. "But she's good, really good. Don't worry about it. Mom won't interfere with us." "I thought she wanted a different wife for you, from a wealthier family." "No," Mark smiled. "You just don't know her. She doesn't judge people like that. The main thing for her is what kind of person they are themselves. And you're wonderful, and Mom definitely understood that. She's a good judge of character." They saw each other sometimes at family holidays or just casually, sometimes having lunch or dinner together. Eleanor made no attempts to get closer, but she didn't show any dislike either, never tried to sting or insult the low-born girl. Sarah sold her apartment, the money was invested in the business, and the business began to grow and prosper. Sales increased, new clients appeared. The small company turned into a fairly powerful player on the market. The business required a lot of time and effort, so first Sarah quit her job, and then Mark left his uncle's firm. The spouses focused entirely on their own business. Both worked from dawn till dusk, standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, like two dedicated warriors. They weren't afraid of work or difficulties, and all this bore fruit. There was almost no time left for rest. Sarah spent days on end at the office. Mark traveled all over the country looking for large clients and the best suppliers. Each had their own role, and each understood that only together were they strong. The spouses had many plans and ideas for business development. The common goal brought them closer, made them seem like one whole. Sarah was amazed by her husband's work capacity and enthusiasm, and he never tired of praising her. Sarah was excellent at financial reports, planning, and it was in her head that successful ideas most often originated. The spouses understood. They were very close to their dream. Very soon their business would be able to work almost independently, and they would gain freedom, money, the opportunity to travel and rest a lot. The young people even enjoyed working, achieving success, winning, overcoming difficulties. But still, they sometimes wanted a more flexible schedule. Both felt that this was possible, they just needed to work a little more. And then, an unexpected pregnancy, like a bolt from the blue. The spouses hadn't thought about children yet, it wasn't the time. What kind of child could there be with such busy parents? No, heirs were planned, of course, but in the distant future. The birth of children was postponed until those happy times when Mark and Sarah's company could finally function without their constant supervision and participation. Sarah initially decided that the dizziness, nausea, and abdominal pain were all from overwork. Or perhaps her stomach was acting up. After all, she and her husband often ate quickly, dry food, and sometimes forgot to eat altogether. But the unpleasant condition didn't subside. Sarah had to see a doctor. In the hospital, she was stunned by the news of her pregnancy, advised to register immediately, and prescribed vitamins. Sarah returned home in tears. Mark was working remotely from the apartment that day on his laptop. Seeing his upset wife, the man turned pale. He knew that his faithful wife had gone to the hospital, and he thought she had serious health problems. "I'm expecting a baby," Sarah almost whispered. "How could this happen? We took all precautions." "A baby!" Mark's face lit up with an inner light. Sarah saw that her husband felt no doubt or torment, but was simply sincerely happy about the news. "Really? That's wonderful. Wonderful." Wonderful. Sarah was surprised. She hadn't expected such a reaction from her husband. She thought he would be flustered, would scold her. But this sincere joy, this radiant smile, Mark's reaction. It greatly influenced Sarah's feelings. The woman suddenly felt joy too. She had a baby under her heart, their baby with Mark. It was wonderful, and no circumstances could overshadow her joy. The spouses hugged and immediately began making plans for the near future. That's how business-minded and practical they both were. It's okay. Our business is already at such a level that I can handle it alone. Mark stroked Sarah's hair. The main thing is we'll have a baby. I've dreamed of it for a long time. I just didn't tell you. I saw you weren't ready yet. Pregnancy isn't a disease, Sarah replied. I'll be able to work even while pregnant, and later when the baby is born too. Not like now, of course, but still. We'll manage everything, don't even worry, Mark assured her. We're together after all. But Sarah was mistaken. The pregnancy was difficult. The expectant mother felt unwell, and she often had to go to the hospital to preserve the pregnancy. Mark assured her that her main job now was to take care of their baby. But Sarah felt somewhat inadequate because she couldn't work, couldn't devote time to their family business, and her husband was spending days on end at the office alone. After all, now he was left alone with all the problems and affairs. This upset Sarah. The woman hoped that when the child was born, it would become easier. Not immediately, of course, a little later, but children grow up so quickly. Sophie was born significantly prematurely. Due to prematurity, the baby had health problems. Sarah completely immersed herself in treatment and withdrew from business affairs. Although no, not completely. Mark still needed his wife's help with reports, and she, after a difficult day with her daughter, would sit at the kitchen table at night and delve into financial indicators, summarize results, and draw important conclusions about the business's development. Mark trusted her in this, and Sarah valued that trust. Although it was hard for her, her eyes were closing, her head ached, but Sarah didn't complain. She even liked the feeling. Sitting on maternity leave, she hadn't lost her touch, she was still good. Sophie gradually grew stronger. The diagnoses that doctors had initially warned about receded, but the girl was still capricious and sickly. She required a lot of attention. Sarah was very tired. It was good that Eleanor took some of the care upon herself. Sarah's mother-in-law simply adored her granddaughter, smiled at her, spoke gentle words. Both Sarah and even Mark were surprised by this. Mom just transforms when she's with Sophie. The young father shook his head. I've never seen her like this, not even when I was little. Sophie had performed a real miracle. She had melted the Snow Queen's heart. However, this had little effect on Eleanor and Sarah's relationship. The mother-in-law still kept her distance. Only now, of course, they saw each other more often. Eleanor often came to Sarah's to take her granddaughter for a walk. For the young mother, this was a time of rest and peace, which she needed like air. 5 years passed. Sarah never managed to return to full-time work. She had to take care of Sophie. The girl still needed rehabilitation, constant therapy. She often caught colds. Her prematurity had an effect, so the girl couldn't attend kindergarten. Sarah still helped her husband with reports at night. This was a significant amount of work, but still not quite full-time. Before they were equal partners, but now Mark was carrying the family business alone. Sarah only helped. There was no shortage of money. The business brought in a stable income, but the dream of the business operating independently was still far off. So Mark was always at work, and Sarah? She stayed at home, taking care of the child in the household. Mostly Sophie. This was Sarah's separate victory. Doctors had predicted the girl would be almost a vegetable, warning of serious impairments. But constant therapy and rehabilitation worked wonders. Sophie was now not particularly different from her peers. Well, she was thin, of course, and got sick often, but otherwise, she was a perfectly normal child. And only Sarah knew what work had gone into all of this. And she understood. There was still a lot of work ahead, but Sophie's prospects were excellent, which meant she needed to roll up her sleeves and work. Sarah was used to that. The woman had absolutely no time for herself. The child, the reports, the household chores, all this took a lot of energy. Sarah hadn't liked looking in the mirror lately. She had gained weight. Not completely fat, but not the graceful gazelle she had been 5 years ago either. Her skin was gray from lack of sleep. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was always pulled back in a messy bun. Sarah now chose a sporty style of clothing. Her former narrow skirts and stylish blouses hung in the far corner of the closet. High-heeled shoes gathered dust there too. Jeans, loose t-shirts, sneakers. That's what made up Sarah's everyday wardrobe now. It was comfortable, and the extra pounds weren't as noticeable, Besides, you couldn't exactly chase after a lively child on playgrounds in heels. Her friend Alice from university days scolded Sarah. "You give your whole self to the family. Do you think anyone appreciates it? Hardly. You can't do that. You need to think about yourself too." "Of course I need to," Sarah agreed. "But how? Who will take care of Sophie, the house, the financial reports?" Sarah preferred to think that this state of affairs was a temporary measure. Her daughter would grow up, then she would take care of herself and return to full-time work. She just needed to be patient. It was just a phase. Only this phase never seemed to end. Mark somehow became distant. Understandably, work, many worries, troubles. But still, the man now returned home late, or sometimes even stayed overnight at the office. He listened to his wife with half an ear. Sophie's affairs barely interested him, and yet it was he who had once convinced Sarah to keep the child. The only thing they talked about from time to time was the financial reports that Sarah checked and compiled. Colleagues, the boss, his subordinates, spouses. They no longer went out together as before, didn't go anywhere, not even to corporate events. Mark preferred to go alone. "Well, there's no one to leave Sophie with. And anyway, you won't be interested there. You hardly know anyone anymore. The crowd has completely changed. I wouldn't go myself, but my position requires it." Sarah understood perfectly why Mark avoided going out together. Sarah had never been stupid. Of course her husband was ashamed of his wife, of the way she had become, overweight, tired. He himself had been like that a few years ago, but their family life, a difficult, sickly child had played their part. It was painful to realize this. But what could she do? Sarah blamed herself for not managing everything, and perhaps somehow organizing her time incorrectly and prioritizing wrongly. Mark even started avoiding his wife's touch. Sarah tried to hug him, to snuggle up to him. The man invariably pulled away. It was as if a wall had grown between them, an invisible one. Sarah hoped she could restore their former relationship. She read articles by psychologists, looked for information. She started doing sit-ups at home. There was still no time for the gym, and she exercised with Sophie in front of the TV. Both of them even started to enjoy it. Sarah understood. Her marriage was in danger, and as a woman, she now bore great responsibility. Sarah was determined to fight for her family's happiness. At that time, she didn't understand yet, didn't know that it wasn't about her at all. The epiphany happened late in the evening. Mark, as usual, returned late. Sophie was already asleep in her room. Sarah was reading, lying in bed. Mark looked somehow gloomy, thoughtful. He immediately went to the bathroom, leaving his phone, which he usually never let go of, on the nightstand. And then, while he was in the shower, his phone vibrated. Sarah knew. Her husband could be called for work at any moment. The company's partners lived and worked in different time zones, so such late calls were not uncommon. Sarah decided to answer the call just in case, maybe it was urgent. "Hello, Mr. Miller," a polite male voice said on the phone. "This is from the Rosa Ventorum restaurant. Your lovely companion left her handbag on the table. I assure you it's perfectly fine. A courier will deliver it to any address you provide. We take care of our regular customers." Sarah carefully pressed the disconnect button. Almost immediately, the phone vibrated again. Perhaps the person from the restaurant still intended to get the address where the handbag needed to be delivered. Sarah hung up the call. She pulled the blanket up, lay on her side, pulling her knees to her chin, and thought. Water was running in the bathroom. Her husband, Mark, was standing under the shower there. The man Sarah trusted implicitly, apparently in vain. She thought their difficulties were temporary, that everything would work out, settle down, if only she put in a little effort, and their relationship would blossom again. And now it turned out that her faithful husband was a regular customer of one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, and he was there with a lovely companion, as the employee of Rosa Ventorum called her. The most offensive thing was that there could be no mistake here, because Mark was called by his full name and patronymic, so there was no point in hoping that someone had dialed the wrong number. Mark Miller and his lovely companion. So, Mark had a mistress. Well, a wealthy man could certainly afford that. So, work wasn't the reason her husband was constantly absent from home now. His frequent business trips? Perhaps it was just a vacation with his mistress. And Sarah, she had even felt sorry for her husband, that poor thing, working so hard, never seeing the light of day. So, while she was battling Sophie's problems alone, helping the child get back on her feet, ensuring comfort in the house, poring over financial reports at night, Mark was having fun. He had stopped paying attention to his wife and daughter, and Sarah even blamed herself for it. How foolish she had been not to notice. At that moment, Mark came out of the bathroom. Sarah looked at her husband with completely different eyes. She noticed how athletic and toned his body was. Of course, he had set up a mini gym right in the office. Tanned, handsome, self-confident, and wealthy too. Naturally, such a man was a magnet for women. Sarah suddenly felt sorry for herself. Mark had lived the way he wanted all these years. He loved himself and put himself first. And Sarah? For her, the interests of the family were paramount, and this was the result. She didn't even recognize herself in the mirror. "Your lovely companion forgot her bag," Sarah said in a matter-of-fact tone, sitting up in bed. "What?" Mark was taken aback. "So you took my phone?" "I answered the call. I thought it was for work, but it was about something completely different. A lovely companion." Mark quickly composed himself. He went to the closet, took out his pajamas, and started changing, as if nothing had happened. There wasn't a hint of guilt or confusion, as if it was perfectly normal. "So you don't want to tell me anything?" Sarah felt herself boiling. Unlike her husband, it was hard for her to remain calm. "Well, you seem to have found out everything yourself." Mark took a blanket and pillow from the bed. It was clear he was going to sleep in the living room, on the sofa, and rightly so after such a revelation. And yet… Okay, Mark looked at his wife with a calm, confident gaze, and this infuriated her even more. "Okay, yes, I have a woman. Young, beautiful, interesting. I find her interesting and fun, you understand? I feel like I'm energized by her, and she loves me." "But I love you too." The words escaped Sarah's lips before she could think. She didn't want to confess her feelings to her cheating husband in such a situation at all. But it was the truth. Sarah truly loved Mark. He was still the closest and dearest person to her. "You love me?" Mark sneered. "It doesn't seem like it. All I hear from you is Sophie, Sophie, as if there are no other topics. And anyway, look at yourself, what you've turned into. At first, I didn't understand what was going on. My feelings for you seem to be cooling, and you're not just standing still, you're degrading." Her husband's words wounded Sarah deeply. It was offensive and unfair. "You used to be smart, beautiful. I've realized that I need to accept it. We've just grown up, everyday life, a child. Perhaps strong feelings, bright emotions only happen in youth. And then I met her, Chloe. It was as if she breathed life into me. Everything around me became bright and interesting again. I was living, truly living. But at home, here, with you, that same melancholy, that feeling of hopelessness inevitably washes over me again. Chloe gives me strength and energy. She inspires me." "Chloe," Sarah repeated. So that was the name of her husband's lovely companion. She was probably a real beauty with a model's appearance. Mark would hardly have paid attention to anyone else. "We are both to blame for this," the man said. Now there was some note in his voice. Only Sarah couldn't determine if it was sincere or put on, fitting the moment. "Well, since you know everything now, it's time to talk about divorce. Chloe is tired of being my mistress, tired of hiding. I was going to tell you everything myself. It was hard to decide. And then this happened. It's even good that it happened this way." "Not now," Sarah shook her head. "I need to think about everything." "Of course." Mark nodded and left the bedroom with the blanket and pillow in his hands. Of course, Sarah couldn't sleep that night. She cried, quietly burying her face in the pillow. Tears brought temporary relief, and then the mental torment began again. The woman blamed herself, then Mark, then this unknown Chloe. What kind of creature must she be to have an affair with a married man? And Sarah also thought about the future. How would they live separately now? They would have to divide property. Also a difficult and lengthy process. Sophie, of course, she was almost not attached to her father at all, but the girl would still ask questions. What should she answer? How to explain the situation to a 5-year-old child? Towards morning, Sarah fell into a heavy sleep. Sophie woke her up. Mark was already gone. He had left for work. Or maybe not for work. Who knew now? 3 days passed. During this time, Mark lived somewhere away from home, probably with his mistress. Perhaps he was renting an apartment for her, or who knew, maybe he had already bought some apartments for Chloe. Sarah was gradually getting used to the idea of divorce. She had accepted it. It was hard, of course, but she wasn't the first, she wouldn't be the last. Anything can happen. The woman began planning her future without her husband, thinking about how to live on. She was almost not worried about the financial side. Sarah had been compiling financial reports for the company for so many years. She understood perfectly that their family business brought in more than good income. It was a profitable business. After selling it, they could get good money. This would be enough for a beautiful, comfortable life. Besides, there was also the property acquired during the marriage, the apartment they had bought recently, several expensive cars. They certainly wouldn't starve with their daughter. She could even choose not to file for alimony. But then an unpleasant surprise awaited Sarah. They met with Mark in a cafe to discuss the details of the divorce. For some reason, Sarah dressed as if for a date. For the first time in a long time, she put on light makeup, wore a dress. "Sit down," Mark gestured to his wife to a table. "You look good, well done." Perhaps he was trying to be polite and gallant. Betrayal? Yes, betrayal. That's exactly what it was called. They talked a little about Sophie. Then Mark asked, "Have you decided where you'll live now?" "What?" Sarah was taken aback. "Are you planning to sell the apartment? I somehow thought you'd leave it to us for now. This isn't the time to deal with selling. Sophie has another rehabilitation session coming up. Let's sell the apartment later." "Sell it? No. Chloe and I plan to live there. She likes the area, she likes the apartment itself. She already has a bunch of ideas about renovations. So..." "And what if I don't agree?" Sarah felt rage wash over her. Mark had changed so much. He was ready to kick his daughter and ex-wife out of the apartment to fulfill the desire of a new woman. Outrageous. Sarah, on principle, would not let the traitor carry out his plan. "And your consent is not required," Mark said. "How so?" "The apartment was acquired during the marriage. It's jointly acquired property, which means everything is registered in my mother's name. The business, the apartment, the cars, even the bank account is in her name. As I said, you've been distracted lately. You don't even pay attention to these details." "You only mentioned one of the cars." Sarah shook her head bitterly. Yes, Mark had indeed registered a new car in Eleanor's name somehow. He explained it by saying that pensioners had tax benefits. Apparently, for the same reason, he had re-registered their joint business in his mother's name. Only he hadn't even consulted his wife about it. "You did this behind my back. Well, I'll be damned, you're a real monster." "Don't exaggerate," Mark calmly objected. "Behind what back? I brought you documents to sign at home. As always, you only thought about the child and getting to bed early. And I didn't hide anything, you just didn't pay attention." Sarah remembered that period. At that time, Sophie's life and health were literally hanging by a thread. Doctors were giving frightening diagnoses. Treatment required Sarah's full involvement. She was burnt out and had indeed lost her touch. She simply had no strength left for anything else except her daughter. Perhaps Mark was re-registering their property at that very moment. "Everything is registered in my mother's name, so you and I actually have nothing to divide." "That's not fair. How can you do this to me? To us? What about Sophie?" "I'll pay alimony for Sophie, decent alimony. It will be enough for renting accommodation, for living, and for treatment if needed." "But we built this company together from scratch. I sold my only home for our business, invested everything in it because I was sure, we are together, we will support each other. And now you are doing this to me." "To be completely honest, I was mostly in charge of the company. You stayed at home, you weren't particularly interested in the firm's affairs. What about the reports? You dumped a huge amount of work on me. It was hard for me. I didn't sleep at night. I compiled reports, and in the morning I had to run to hospitals with my daughter again. Do you have any idea what that cost me? Why are you acting like a child? That's such a minor thing, it's not even worth talking about. Thank you for your help. I won't leave you without means of subsistence either. I'll help. Thank you very much, Sarah blurted out with bitterness in her voice. Keep in mind, I won't give up what's mine so easily. I'll fight. I'll hire lawyers. That's your right, but you'll just waste time and money. Everything is legally clean according to the documents. The business is registered in my mother's name, the apartment and cars too. Your lawyers will tell you exactly the same thing. He left, and Sarah sat in the cafe for a long time, digesting the new information. Just as she had recovered from the shock of Mark's betrayal, now there was this. Sarah did hire lawyers. This dragged out the divorce process. The woman now had to spend a lot of time in court. Eleanor took care of her daughter during this time. Yes, the same mother-in-law in whose name, as it turned out, all the spouse's property was registered. Sarah simply had no one else to turn to. She understood, of course, that Eleanor would support her son in everything. And besides, there had never been a warm and trusting relationship between them. Eleanor kept her distance from Sarah. Lately, she had stopped coming to see her granddaughter too. But when her daughter-in-law called and asked for help, she didn't refuse. Sarah didn't even start talking about business with her mother-in-law. She understood. She would obey her son in everything. She would do whatever Mark said. But with her granddaughter, she greatly helped her almost former daughter-in-law. Sarah couldn't even afford a nanny. As it turned out, she now had absolutely nothing. And she was living not on the money the joint business brought in, as the woman had thought before, but on handouts from her successful husband. Humiliating and offensive. Sarah now knew what that Chloe looked like. She sometimes appeared at court hearings with Mark. Tall, dark-skinned, long-legged, and very slim. Long dark brown hair flowed beautifully over her graceful shoulders. Mark's hand was almost always on Chloe's waist, and she looked at him so devotedly that Sarah began to understand her husband. It was probably hard to resist the special gaze of such a beauty. Mark. It turned out Sarah had never known him, or perhaps he had suddenly changed drastically, literally transformed into another person. The bond that had been between them was slowly and painfully breaking. That was also difficult. Sarah turned off the light and lay down in what was still her bedroom, cozy and familiar. Soon, she and Sophie would have to leave this apartment. Although there was still hope, albeit a weak one, tomorrow was the decisive hearing that would finally clarify everything. However, Sarah's lawyers couldn't do anything, and at the final hearing, the judge delivered the verdict. All documents were properly executed, the spouses had no joint property. However, Sophie was awarded alimony, a pittance, as Mark, of course, had set his official salary to the minimum. Sarah walked out of the courthouse on shaky legs. She was left with nothing. Sarah saw Mark gallantly open the door of his new SUV for Chloe. She somehow gracefully slid into the cabin, and then they sped away. And what was she to do? How to raise Sophie? She couldn't even send her to kindergarten to go to work. Her daughter was still too weak and sickly. Sarah called a taxi. She needed to go to her mother-in-law's. But this woman, she was also participating in Mark's treacherous scheme. The mother couldn't not have known about her son's intentions. With a heavy heart, Sarah rang her mother-in-law's doorbell. She lived in a new house in the city center, in a luxurious 2-story apartment. Eleanor opened the door and smiled at Sarah. Yes, she smiled. This was unusual. As she spoke, Eleanor held Sophie in her arms. She was also smiling broadly. "Mommy's here!" the little girl exclaimed happily, reaching out her arms to Sarah. "Come in, we'll have coffee and cake now. We need to talk about a lot." All this felt somehow very strange. Sarah sat modestly on the edge of a chair. "With milk?" Eleanor asked in a matter-of-fact tone. Sarah nodded. "Well, just don't worry." Eleanor sat opposite her daughter-in-law. "I know what happened in court just now. Mark has already reported. You were left with nothing." "Why did he do this to me?" Sarah stammered. She hadn't intended to discuss this with her mother-in-law, but she couldn't help it. And besides, Eleanor herself had started the conversation. "Why did he do this to you? It's not about you at all." The elderly woman shook her head. "Don't even think you did something wrong. You tried very hard. It's in his nature, his genes, I don't know. Maybe I missed something in his upbringing too." Sarah stared at her mother-in-law with wide eyes. She had not expected to hear such words from her at all. Eleanor seemed to be on her daughter-in-law's side, instead of supporting her son. "My current husband, he is not Mark's father, not his real father. His father, Peter, raised him as his own. Only my son's father ran away as soon as he found out about the pregnancy. Or rather, a prettier, brighter, and, importantly, richer girl took him away. And I was left alone. Peter had loved me for a long time. He supported me at that moment and accepted my son as his own. Only Mark, it seems, inherited more from his biological father than I would have liked. He did almost the same thing to his wife as his parents did. Even worse." "I didn't know that." "Well, now you know. Mark is quite a manipulator. Do you know what he told me about you to earn my approval so I would be on his side in the divorce? What did he say? That you were a loose woman and the child wasn't his. Sophie, he told me this not long ago, when he was transferring the property to me. He said that if anything happened, if there was a divorce, he didn't want to give you anything, because you came to everything ready-made." "How did I come to everything ready-made? We built this business together, and I never cheated. Did he really say that about me?" "He did. And I believed him, you see. I always dreamed of having a daughter, but God didn't give Peter and me children together. And then there was Sophie, my granddaughter, a girl, a princess, my beloved baby. I simply doted on her. I don't think I've ever loved anyone as much in my life as I love her. And then Mark says she's not related to me, that you had the child out of wedlock. Oh, how angry I was with you then. Maybe you noticed, I stopped coming to see you. I missed little Sophie very much, but I thought maybe if I saw her less often, I would forget about her and it wouldn't hurt so much. But nothing worked. My heart still ached for the baby." Meanwhile, Eleanor's son had initiated divorce proceedings. Mark was very happy that all his property was registered in his mother's name and his unfaithful wife would get nothing. And Eleanor thought it was fair. Indeed, a cunning girl came out of nowhere, dumped a strange child on her husband. However, Eleanor might have been able to understand this. She had been in the same situation herself. Peter also took her in with a child. Only she was faithful to her husband and grateful for his support, for not leaving her in trouble. And this Sarah, she continued to go out, at least that's what Mark said. The man was tormented, suffered, tried to reason with his wife, and then he met a new woman and decided that things couldn't continue like this. So he initiated this divorce, and his mother supported him. Who wants to see their child, even if grown-ups suffer? Sarah hired lawyers. She really didn't want to part with her property. One of them became very active, and he found out that Sarah had invested in the business, not only through hard work, but also with money. And Eleanor had doubts. This lawyer made her think. She hired someone to find out everything for her. That's when everything became clear. Yes, indeed, many years ago, Sarah had sold her apartment, and the spouses had started their business with that money. And then Eleanor understood that Mark hadn't told her the whole truth. And then she had hope. What if the words about her granddaughter were also a lie? Eleanor kept a lock of Mark's hair in a small envelope in a family album. She had saved the first lock of her son's hair that was cut. Many people did that back then. Her granddaughter. Purely intuitively, before the last hearing, Eleanor decided to have a DNA test done. She had the material readily available. And today the results came. Sophie is Mark's daughter and my granddaughter. There is no doubt about it. Forgive me for doubting you, but Mark can be very convincing. After the divorce, Mark flew off to the sea with Chloe of course, to celebrate victory and liberation. The young people decided to mark the successful completion of the long and stressful process with a bang, chose a luxurious resort, spared no expense. Mark believed that all the property was now his. Chloe was also sure of it. She loved a bright, beautiful life and believed she deserved it. Not everyone is gifted with such dazzling looks at birth. Chloe treated her beauty as capital and hardly hid it. In fact, that's why Mark tried so hard to win everything from his ex-wife. He understood that to afford a beauty like Chloe, he needed money. Now he had it. The man had no doubts about his mother. He had worked on her thoroughly. His mother considered Sarah a loose woman and hated her for giving her a granddaughter who, as it soon turned out, was not related to Eleanor by blood at all. She had already loved the girl with all her heart. Upon Mark's return, a most unpleasant surprise awaited him. It turned out that his mother had sold everything. The business, the property, everything. She could do this herself without anyone's knowledge since everything was registered in her name. Only Mark couldn't have imagined that his mother would do such a thing. He was 100% sure of her. Eleanor gave the money to her granddaughter and former daughter-in-law. All the money. Now Sarah was rich and he, Mark, was left with nothing. However, his ex-wife showed unprecedented generosity and nobility. When Mark had somewhat recovered from the blow, Sarah transferred half of those funds to him. She didn't even call her ex-husband. She wrote him a letter. "We built this business together. The company is our joint creation. You betrayed me, you acted terribly. But I am not like you. As it turned out, we are very, very different. It is fair to give you half of our money, so I will act justly. Nothing connects us anymore." Starting a new business from scratch turned out to be far less profitable than the previous one. Back then, Sarah was by his side. They created the company together, supported each other, fought shoulder to shoulder. And now Mark was alone with all the problems, and he didn't always handle them perfectly. Mark lost most of the funds he received after the divorce. He invested unsuccessfully, made a number of mistakes, and this was the result. Chloe, of course, soon left Mark. She found a richer, more successful man. And Sarah. She moved with her daughter to another city where she decided to start over. She now had money to live on. Sarah and Sophie traveled a lot, exploring the world. It was very exciting and captivating. Sarah didn't maintain contact with Mark, and he didn't seek communication either. Perhaps he was simply ashamed to look his ex-wife in the eye. But Sarah became truly friends with Eleanor. They often traveled somewhere together, talked a lot, and Sarah felt quite happy. She knew a long, fulfilling life and many interesting encounters lay ahead of her.